What if I told you you had the ability to save 8 lives? This is my audience. I've got my brother Brady, my dad, and my mom videoing. My topic is over organ transplants. I'll be touching on a few interesting stories, the history of it, and wrapping up with what to expect in the future. In 1954, the first kidney transplant was a success. They lived 8 years after, and they were identical twins, which means there was no rejection of the kidney. In 1967, the first successful heart transplant was a success, but unfortunately the patient died 18 days later from pneumonia due to the immune system being compromised. In 1969, the first skin transplant was performed. It was a Swiss doctor named Jacques Louis Reverdin. He found that successful skin grafts were required to have thinner tissues. In 1906, the first transplant of a cornea was completed. 1954, like I said earlier, the first successful kidney transplant was performed. They were identical brothers, and there was no rejection. In 1963, the first organ recovery from a brain-dead donor was accomplished. 1967, the first U.S. heart transplant was a success, but the patient died 18 days later from pneumonia, like I said earlier. In 1981, the first heart and lung transplant was completed. In 1983, the first successful single lung transplant with a survival rate of over 6 years was accomplished. That was unheard of for living that long after a transplant. In 1994, the first successful 6-organ transplant was completed. It was a 34-year-old who ended up dying 6 years later, suddenly. In 1998, the first successful hand transplant was completed in France, but it was removed in 2001 due to an episode of rejection. In 2005, the first successful partial face transplant was accomplished in France. In 2008, the first multi-organ transplant performed on an 8-year-old, just like I said earlier. This time, this girl received an esophagus, a liver, a stomach, a spleen, pancreas, and a small intestine. It was a 14.5-hour long surgery, and the reason why they needed it was because she had cancer spreading all throughout her organs, and the doctor said the only way to save her was to replace all those organs at once. The biggest problems in the 1960s were the anti-rejection treatments and the weak immune system that was caused by the surgeries. By the 1970s, a new drug helped patients live up to 5 or 6 years after the surgery. Now, every 10 minutes, someone is added to the waiting list. An average of 21 people die each day waiting for an organ. But one donor can save up to 8 lives. The most common transplants is the kidney, and the least transplant is actually the intestines. 123,886 people are on the waiting list currently. 16,884 transplants were performed just between January and July of this year. So far, only 8,279 donors have donated between that time as well. The biggest issue is the waiting list nowadays, not necessarily the rejection. Of the 123,886 people on the waiting list, just 79,345 of them are active on the waiting list. This means that they're waiting to get news whether they have found an organ, let alone if it's a match. Now, what to expect in the future. Everyone knows about the 3D printing. That's a new trend, so to speak. Researchers working on 3D printing organs and tissues. According to Sophie Novak of the National Journal, the Defense Department granted $24 million to use to have research on printed tissues that can fight against strong chemical and biological warfare. The main goal, obviously, is to fill the gap between organ supply and the demand of transplants. Researchers are starting with tissues and working up towards the organs. The liver will be the first organ, and slowly moving towards the very complicated heart with all kinds of moving parts inside of it. A team at Cornell University led by Jonathan Butcher has been layering living cells on top of one another to create tissues. And once you perform tissues, then you can start layering tissues to make organs. Butcher's team keeps learning from their mistakes and are looking towards the promising future for transplants. That's all I have for transplants. I appreciate you looking. I hope you learned something new today.